Hey, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Starback with you guys. Today we're looking at Chapter 12, Key Issues 3 and 4, and we are talking about where are business services distributed, and then why do services cluster in settlements. So we're starting to kind of look at why are those services, why are all these different services, business or consumer or whatever it may be, why are they clustering in cities essentially is what we're looking at. All right, so let's take a look here as we get into things. We start off with our first question here. What are characteristics of global cities? And so we're starting to kind of look at urban areas here as well. We'll get more into that here in our next chapter. But if we take a look, obviously global cities are large cities, these worldwide cities from around the world. They are centers of information. They are centers of money and finance and capital. They tend to be very high density business service areas. And you can kind of see what kind of our hierarchy here. We go from alpha plus plus to alpha plus all the way down to beta and gamma. And you can take a look. The main alpha plus plus cities around the world: New York, London, Paris, Beijing, Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Tokyo. Right. So we've got all those major global cities there. And then you can see we've got some smaller ones. If you take a close look there in Minnesota, you can see that Minneapolis and St. Paul are technically considered a gamma city here, all right, beta or gamma city. And so we've got all these different major cities or global cities around the world. If we take a look at those world cities or those global cities, we can see that business services are attracted to those areas. A lot of corporations are based out of these major global cities around the globe. And so if we look at major financial services tend to be based off of those areas or based in those areas, services that are going to benefit corporations or large companies. We see a lot of stock markets tend to be housed there. Think New York and the New York Stock Exchange. We also see a lot of different lawyer industries or services and accountants and advertising and marketing all cluster together in those cities as well, because you've got large corporations and large businesses who are going to use those. So those are your business services then. And so we can think about, are there any corporate headquarters in Minnesota? And actually, I've given you a picture of one right there. We've got 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, is actually headquartered in Oakdale, Minnesota. But we've got some other ones. One that wasn't originally headquartered here, but is now Buffalo Wild Wings is headquartered here. We've got Honeywell, General Mills. There's all kinds of large ones. Target Corporation. So there's a lot of large corporations that are global that are headquartered here in Minnesota. Something that's not in your book, guys, is looking at something we call an agglomeration. And when we talk about agglomerations, these are industries or activities that cluster together in one kind of concentrated area. And they do that for benefits. A lot of the benefit is for cost advantage, but there's other benefits for them as well. And so if we think of some of these examples, they cluster together for the skilled labor in those places. They cluster together for maybe the technology benefits, or like we said, financial ways for them to save money. And we can kind of think of this as Weber's least cost theory. And the idea is that we're clustering together in a small area in order to save money. It's the best place for us to be, close to those resources that they need. And so examples of this might be like Hollywood or Wall Street. You could even think of like Madison Avenue. Silicon Valley is a good example of this when we look at technology. We can also think of this on maybe a little bit smaller scale and talk about like industrial parks, areas of a city that have been kind of given over or specific for development of industry. They may all locate in those industrial parks then. We also have the opposite of agglomeration, which is deglomeration. And that's where we start to see kind of the regulation of agglomeration. A lot of times government agencies may step in and try to kind of push activities or push these industries to different areas rather than all conglomerated in one spot. And so when we look at this all comes down to the cumulative causation. And that is if one company or one industry is successful doing this, then others are going to come to that place as well and do the same thing. All right. So here's some other examples of global corporations in these global world cities here. BP, British Petroleum, is in London. IBM is centered in New York. We've got the Tokyo Stock Exchange there. Tokyo with Toyota as well. All right. So again, major global cities tend to bring in major corporations and other financial institutions. Then we can shift over looking at consumer services. Why are consumer services then in global cities? Well, and it kind of goes together. If you're going to have a lot of businesses there, you're going to have a lot of people there, right? And so the people that come to there, we look at a lot of the global cities or these world cities have major consumer services. And so we see there's a lot of money in those cities, which means people want luxury items in those global world cities. And so we see a lot more leisure service activities happening as well. And those are a lot of times having high thresholds. I mean, they need lots of people, and people will come from long ways away in order to patronize those services. And so we think of things like concerts and opera houses or sporting events, nightclubs, restaurants. Basically, if whatever you're thinking of, think New York City. And that is what we're looking at here. New York City has massive abundance of restaurants, massive number of sports teams and theaters and museums, and I mean, it's the place to go for all of those different leisure activities and those luxury activities. And so that's what we're looking at with consumer services. They locate there because the people are there and the money is there. Another green slide here, guys, something not in your book. We look at synergy, and this is when you have something being kind of cross-promotionized. You have promotion between two different goods and services that are sort of vertically integrated. When we talk about that, think of it like this example we have there. In the Magic Kingdom, they have things like McDonald's Frontier Fries. Right. So in Frontierland, they may have fries specifically from McDonald's, or like the example in our picture there, Mickey's PhilharMagic, which is a place you can go and watch little video clips and things. It is presented by Kodak Film. And so we see this kind of cross promotion. You've got Disney involved. You've also got another group involved, like in this case, the film company or a food industry or food company as well involved. All right, so you've got cross promotion between two different goods and services coming together to promote each other. We also have public services, and they tend to be located in these global world cities as well. Again, centers of power. A lot of times, these world cities or these global cities are capitals. Not always, but a lot of times they are capital cities. Example, New York City, not a capital city. It was at one point, but it's not today, right? But we do know that there are other kind of world organizations that are located there. All right. We also see that there are palaces, legislatures, courts, government buildings, whatever it may be. A lot of times we'll locate in these global cities. And so when we look at that, a couple of good examples here we see like New York City has the United Nations, Brussels has the headquarters of the European Union. And so those are what we're talking about. So not just like capitals and government officials or government buildings for that country, but international global centers as well. We also have a hierarchy of these global cities, and we kind of talked a little bit about the alpha plus and the beta and the gamma, and we do have these different levels here. There are 3 levels overall. Alpha, which then is broken down into multiple levels as well, beta, and then gamma. And so when we look at, there's a lot of factors that go into ranking a global city, and it comes down to economic, political, cultural, infrastructure, communications, and transportation. So if you look at, obviously, again, we've talked economic, there's going to be a lot of corporate headquarters there. They're going to have business services. Political, we'll see that there tends to be headquarters of political institutions there, or they might be capital cities, like in this case, London, right? We see from a cultural standpoint, there's going to be a lot of cultural institutions there: media, sports, education, museums, whatever else may be. We look at the infrastructure, and tends to have an international airport located in the city or near the city. There also is going to be a lot of healthcare areas that you can come to, and again, it could be an international thing, like the Mayo Clinic even. All right. We look at communications, and so we talk about the technology being increased to allow communications in that area and global communication. And then transportation. They're going to allow for increased speed of goods and information going in and out of that global city. All right. So here are the global cities that we can look at in North America, all the way from alpha plus plus to alpha minus, and then down to beta and gamma as well. So you can see Minneapolis is technically considered a beta city. You can see the closest alpha city we have in the area, actually it might be alpha minus, is Chicago. Actually, it might be alpha, I think. It's tough to tell. It looks like it's alpha, yep. You've got Toronto, New York as being your kind of alpha and alpha plus plus as well. You can see some of the others around the globe here, or around the country as well, right? So, what are business services in lesser developed countries? So, when we're talking about developing nations or developing countries or our lesser developed countries, there are two major business services that tend to locate in those places. We see offshore financial services. These are usually small islands or small countries. Sometimes they're even colonies. And a lot of times they are used for like tax benefits or tax shelters for uber wealthy or for industry. And so they'll locate their financial services in those small places because they don't have income tax essentially on their products or on their money. So there would be some kind of banking or financial services located there. When they talk about like a Cayman account or something like that, that's talking about the Cayman Islands, and they have a lot of offshore financial services there as well. We look at the idea of business processing or outsourcing, so BPOs. Sometimes they're considered or called back office functions. And so when we look at that, a lot of times routine clerical work and things like that, it could be information technology, a lot of times, or telecommunications. It will happen in some of these lesser developed countries, especially if those are English speaking countries. It's a way for them to lower the cost of their employees, send those jobs or outsource those jobs or offshore those jobs to another country, and save some money in the long run. As long as you've got you no longer need that close proximity to the headquarters. You can do this from across the world because of telecommunications, because of the internet. And so we see, like I said, those lower wage jobs, especially for English speaking countries, specifically India is a really big one. We see that they tend to attract these back offices. So a lot of telecommunications and call center jobs are shifted to India or other English speaking lesser developed countries as well. So you can see some of the offshore financial services around the world. So you can see, especially in the Caribbean, those are a lot of different, and Central America, a lot of different kind of offshoring of those financial institutions we talked about, right? Kind of the tax sheltering. We can see some of the others being moved to other parts of the world too. You can see in the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean as well being big areas where we see some of this back office or offshore financial service centers here. So we talk about something being offshored. This is another way of talking about what outsourced work is. And when we talk about outsourced work, it's when the company sends their work to another company to do it for them, essentially. But when we talk about offshoring, that means that the job is legitimately being pushed to another country. It's being pushed off of the shores of the United States to another country. And so this right here is an estimate of the U.S. jobs that were offshored in the year 2015. So you can see about 3.5 million jobs were offshored to other countries. And again, that's the idea of that back office institutions or back office jobs here, where you've got some clerical work, or maybe you've got some copying work, or perhaps you've got telecommunication work going on behind the scenes in another country. And then those people are connected to you here. If you have consumer issues or you need to talk to someone over the phone, you'll probably get someone in another country. We also can look at some of the economic bases of settlements. When we talk about why companies and why we see these global cities, it's because a lot of the economic bases of those cities. Basic industry tends to sell products and services outside of the settlement, and so it measures the percentage of workers in each industry. So we talk about the idea of basic industries. When we look at non-basic industries, that's industries that sell products and services to the community itself. And so when we overall kind of look at the basic and non-basic, we can talk about the economic base. And that's basically a community's unique collection of all the basic industries, all the money that it brings in, all the jobs that they have, all the people that are there. And obviously, because of those jobs and those people and the money being brought in, that attracts additional consumer services to a place. And so if you look at the little graph we have on the right there, that's the Houston Metropolitan Statistical Area, so the Houston area in the year 1986 and then in the year 2009. And you can see that things have changed quite a bit. Right, you've got kind of a change. Specifically, if you look at the diversifying sectors here, you're seeing more jobs coming into Houston. Houston's one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country, and so you can see that we have seen some change over time. Here's some of the other major economic bases of the United States. If you want to look close to home here, Minneapolis, St. Paul, you can see we've got cardiovascular equipment and services is one of the big ones that we have here. If you start looking around a little bit more, you've got Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. Obviously, agricultural equipment, that makes sense, right? Being kind of right in the center of the Corn Belt there. And you can look at some of the others near us. But again, you can see that a lot of these different cities are going to specialize in specific goods. If you look at like Silicon Valley is a good example. That's the tech corridor, the tech industry. You go at microelectronics, biotechnology, and venture capital. Right, or we can look at Southern Florida, and we get into a little bit of the some of the technology in there too, health technology, computers, right? So again, if you want to take a closer look, guys, this is actually in your book, but we can look at what industries are kind of located in those major economic bases of each of these U.S. cities. Another green slide here, guys, something on your book. It talks about some of the new patterns of our economy. And we are a very heavily service economy in the United States. And so when we look at it, services typically are not tied to raw materials anymore or the energy sources. When we talk about like Weber's least cost theory, we're not always tied to those specific raw materials now. But when we look at modern communications, it has advanced things so much that we can kind of reduce the site and situation factors. In fact, major companies here in the United States will locate in different locations rather than centralizing. Like Walmart is their headquarters is located in Bentonville, Arkansas. That's not centralized at all to the entire United States, but they're still able to have their headquarters there and work just fine because the communication has advanced their ability to communicate all across the country very, very easily. Credit card services a lot of times locate in Iowa or Nebraska. Call centers, like we said, could locate in the Philippines. They could locate in Bangalore, India, right? And so all those different, it doesn't really matter where they are anymore because of some of the changes that we're seeing with technology. We can also see a little bit more with these patterns here. It really is kind of associated with this idea of deindustrialization. The United States has gone beyond industrialized nation to more of a service-oriented economy. And so when we talk about this, we can get into the area of maybe what we call economic backwaters. And that's when an area has transitioned into service-based economies, but not all areas have been able to do that yet. And so if you think about that, we can talk about like the Rust Belt, the area from roughly Pennsylvania all the way across to Michigan. That was heavily steel industry, heavily automobile industry for a long time. Well, they've lost a lot of jobs and they have not really transitioned over that service-based economy yet. And so that could be an economic backwater as we talk about it. We look at like Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool in the United Kingdom, same idea. And then we've got Silesia in Poland too. Again, they haven't pushed beyond that industrialized economy yet into that more service oriented. We also look at, again, when you talk about the United States, and we've seen this with our population and migration, but shifting services have moved from the Rust Belt down to the Sun Belt, and we see a lot of the high-tech services located in the South. Specifically, Atlanta is a really good example of this. Atlanta has, again, one of the fastest growing cities in the United States, and metropolitan areas in the United States is Atlanta as well. Atlanta, Houston, Las Vegas, all these major areas in the South and the West are expanding very rapidly. And it's because jobs are shifting there. And we're seeing the service jobs shifting to the Sun Belt. And so you can see some of this right here with that areas that we've seen kind of an increase here in jobs, shifting from that core manufacturing area more to the south. We look at projected electoral college changes. And again, remember, that's based off of our population of each state. You can see that each of those states are going to be losing, in the purple, are going to be losing electoral votes most likely by 2030. And the number they're going to be losing. And you can see where they're shifting. They're shifting to the south. They're shifting to the west. All right, again, more people are moving to those places. We're seeing more jobs in those places. So we're shifting away from that Rust Belt down to that Sun Belt region. We can also talk about place vulnerability. These are factors that make jobs basically obsolete. So if you think of like at the cash registers, right? Today you can go through most businesses, Target and Hy-Vee, Cub, wherever you happen to go. You can walk through and you can check yourself out, right? You can just ring yourself up, bag all your groceries, and you're on good to go. And so we might see something like supermarket cashiers become obsolete in the future. And that's this idea of place vulnerability. So we also get into this idea of outsourcing in the internet. The internet has maybe started to, especially with the rise and increase of online shopping, has maybe started to make some salespeople obsolete, or maybe travel planning. Right? We used to have people who that was their job, right? They were travel agents, and we are seeing less and less people in that industry because people can go on and plan their own trips using Travelocity or whatever the site may be, Kayak. There's all kinds of different sites you can plan your trips on now. All right. We also see like automated answering services, receptionists. There are not very many times that you can call somewhere and you can get a receptionist or a human person versus an automated service asking you to push numbers if you want to talk to certain people and things like that, right? We can also talk about growth poles here when we get into this. So this is kind of the opposite of the economic backwaters. This is when an urban center kind of augments or spurs on the development of its surrounding area, the hinterland area around it. And so it becomes kind of a functional region. And so this is actually Romania here in the picture, and you can see that you've got these major cities all throughout Romania, and then the highlighted areas around it became kind of the functional region that began to augment and spur the development around it. And so those growth poles, those cities, brought in more development around the cities as well. And this is kind of the same idea, only on a larger scale. When we talk about technopoles and technology clusters, we look at this as kind of a high technology corridor. And there's all kinds of examples. The Silicon Valley has this example in California. Boston is like this as well. But a good example as well is this kind of central portion of Florida as kind of a high technology corridor. They've devoted this area to research, development, and kind of the sale of high technology products. And so with this, the idea of the synergistic advantages of all being in one place, they can all promote each other and all work together. It has helped them create good universities, good infrastructure to facilitate this technology corridor. And so we see that as being kind of a major area for technology, just like Silicon Valley, just like areas around Boston as well. Then we get into this idea of brick and mortar versus Footloose, not the movie Footloose, but when we look at brick and mortar, that's the idea of like a store that has an actual location. Like you go to a store to be there. It's brick and mortar. They put it together, right? It's got an actual place to go to in order to actually buy the goods, right? And so we think of like places like Target or Hy-Vee or Kohl's or wherever you might be shopping. They have an actual brick and mortar store for you to go to. We also talk about like Footloose Industries, and this is an industry that would basically the cost of transporting both raw materials and finished product is not important because they don't have a specific location. They're able to be a little bit more kind of like you'd say Footloose, right? They don't have a spot where they are brick and mortar and stuck in one spot. And so think of anything that's e-commerce. All right, any web-based economic activities. Think of Amazon, right? Yes, there is an Amazon store. I believe there's one in New York. I don't know if there's any here in Minnesota yet, but typically what we're looking at is it doesn't matter where you are. You can order whatever you want on Amazon and they'll ship it to you, right? They don't have a specific location that you go to the store and buy the goods. And that's what we're looking at, brick and mortar versus Footloose. And we've seen a huge rise in the Footloose industry with web sales and things like that. We also look at tourism. Tourism is one of the biggest services that we can see when we talk about our services around the world. This is the world's largest sector of the service industry. About $2 trillion yearly is spent on tourism. Probably not as much in 2020, I'm guessing. But when we look at around the globe, tourism is a big moneymaker here. So extensive throughout the world. The Caribbean is big. Africa has become pretty large here in the last few years. Disney, obviously. A lot of people spend a lot of money to go to Disney wherever they're going. Dubai has become a big kind of hub for tourism as well. The issue with this is it's vulnerable to natural disasters. It's also vulnerable to recessions. When the economy's not doing well, people don't travel. Right? When there's a natural disaster, specifically like in the Caribbean, if it comes through, a hurricane comes through and takes out the island, well, it's going to hurt their economy because they aren't going to have people coming in there. Right. And so that's a big deal. When we look at this, there has been a major increase over the last 50 years or so, specifically in Southeast and East Asia. The tourists, people leaving those places and touring and going on tourism. We look at people going to Australia, Africa, the Middle East. So we see a lot more rise in those areas because of it. So as development continues to increase in China and India, we're going to see tourism and people leaving those regions and touring other parts of the world will become greater and greater. So here's some of the examples of world tourism there. You've got obviously cruise lines. There's something called ecotourism where you go through a place and you basically are extremely respectful of that place and you kind of revert back to nature when you're doing it. So think like boundary waters canoe areas, kind of ecotourism, right? If you were to go up there. Finally, we get to cities, and we're starting to look at cities and settlements here. Why do some cities attract talented people? It comes down to a couple things. Cities tend to attract people because there's job opportunities there. There's also financial incentives to living in those cities. But what specifically will attract people to a specific city? All cities have jobs, right? But when we look at, there was a study done by a man named Richard Florida, and he said that basically people are primarily attracted to a city because of cultural reasons. What makes this city a good place to live? And so when we look at this, there's all kinds of different reasons you'd go to a city. We have the coolness factor, right? If it's a good place to live, what are the things you can do there? What makes it a cool place to live? We look at what areas have more scientists, right? People might be attracted to areas because of scientific research being done there, more professionals, university graduates, cultural amenities, the gay index, a higher population of gay people tend to live in those cities as well, the ones on the map there. And so overall, you can see some of the reasons why people may move to cities and where those cities are. And if you take a close look, guys, I would say Minneapolis and the Twin Cities area, probably not a bad place to live, right? It ranks up on the coolness factor, right? It's basically on every one of these maps right here. So sometimes we might take for granted just where we are living. We think, there's nothing to do here. It's cold half the year. But overall, it's actually a fairly good place to live when you start looking at other parts of the country too. Finally, we look at where are these services located today, guys. And when we're looking at services, we can't just look at the urban areas. We also have to look at rural areas. And when we talk about rural areas and rural services, we get into this idea of clustered settlements. And so clustered settlements versus linear settlements is kind of what we're talking about, or dispersed settlements. We have hamlets or villages in rural areas that are these clustered settlements. Sometimes they're more in a circular pattern. Sometimes they're more in a linear pattern. A lot of times we see this clustered settlement more common in European cultures. We see it also in kind of New England area of the United States. But if we go back historically after the enclosure movement, which is associated with the Industrial Revolution, it led to the end of some of this clustering happening in the United Kingdom. And so that's where we see kind of the end of some of that clustered rural areas. We also today typically in the United States see more dispersed settlements outside of New England. Again, New England, we see a lot of clustered settlements, but outside of New England, we see dispersed settlements. So people don't live clustered together in one little village with the farmland on the outside. We tend to see each farm area has kind of their own house and home settlement area. And so we talk about this as dispersion kind of results in a diversity of the settler groups in that area. All right, so if we look at, here's the clustered settlements in rural England. So you can see each one of these little settlements are little cities, and then the farmland is around the city, and people obviously work that land and farm the land around the cities or these little villages. Here is the idea of linear rural settlements. So you can see most of the city is kind of located on this line right here, and then you've got the farmland outside that kind of main street area there. This is pretty popular. These are called long lots. It's pretty popular in Quebec. We also see a little bit of it in the New Orleans or Louisiana area as well, largely because France settled both of those areas originally. And then here we see some clustered rural settlement in Vermont. So again, you've got the city kind of located close together here, this little village or hamlet, and then you can see the land around the outside of it as farmland, and in this case, woodland and things like that as well. And then here's your dispersed settlement. This is more what we see, especially in the Midwest in the United States, right? You've got one little homestead or house, you've got the farmland around it, and then it may be half a mile away, you've got another farm homestead, and then you've got the farmland around it, and so on and so forth. So that's the idea of dispersed versus clustered here. Again, we typically see this more in the United States than the other. We can also start to look at services and kind of the history of services in general. And we talk about the history of services, we get to basically the kind of coordinated with the permanent settlement beginning. So we went all the way back at the very beginning. We talked about the Neolithic agricultural revolution when we talked about agriculture a little bit. This is the idea of after that happened, people started living together in these small little settlements. And when you did that, there was a division of labor that happened. Not everyone needed to farm. Not everyone needed to gather food and make tools. So you had these different jobs for people. And so that's where we get to different services. Eventually, you had public services, people that were there for protection or part of the government, making rules and laws. And then you had business services. Those are people who were storing food, transporting food, maybe hunting. And so we have this kind of division of labor at this time. When we look at the early settlements around the world, there are kind of four hearths of settlement. All of them, when we talk about ancient civilizations, they all developed in rivers. Mesopotamia, South Asia, Egypt, China, all of these major early civilizations are where we begin to see kind of people living in these small groups that eventually over time became these larger cities. And so the earliest cities we can see right there as well. And the later on patterns of settlement started to diffuse over to Europe. And as we move beyond ancient times, we get into kind of early European settlements. When we talk about like the Greek city-states of Athens, Troy, Sparta, Olympia, wherever it may be, we started to have 3, 4, 5,000 people living together in these small little cities. Over time, the Roman Empire grew to the Rome itself grew to about 1 million people, and then the empire, the area that they controlled around Rome, which basically eventually would contain the entire Mediterranean, became more widespread. They'd have military posts all throughout that territory, and then eventually reached the Middle Ages, where you literally got kind of these trading posts that developed. You've got these centers of political and religious power. You've got kind of palaces or castles that are built, and then you've got a city with a wall around it, basically. And we can kind of see this. Some of the examples here. If we go way back to Mesopotamia, this is kind of the ancient city in Mesopotamia, the ancient city of Ur. We've got Athens, which again started out as a small city. You can see the actual current capital city grew up behind it there. If you take a look, kind of see more modern city. And then you've got this example, kind of the Middle Ages or Dark Ages growth here in the city in Belgium. Also, guys, when we look at services in these settlements today, if we kind of fast forward here, 50% of the population live in urban areas. That was as of 2008. It's actually slightly higher today. It's inching up to 55% or almost 60%. But when we look at that, the differences from rural settlements are pretty big. When we talk about urban areas, they're obviously very large in size. There's very high density, a lot of people living in one place. There's a lot of diversity, social heterogeneity. And so we talk about that, lots of different people are living in cities versus living in rural areas. We tend to see less diversity in rural areas versus urban areas. And so when we talk about this growth of the urban settlement in general, urbanization has rapidly increased since the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s. In more developed countries, we see about 75% of the people in the country live in urban areas. In lesser developed countries, it's about 40%. All right, but we're seeing this kind of reflection of development in general. We're starting to see more places developing, and we're seeing more urbanized areas as well. And so both more developed countries and less developed countries, or developing countries, all have large cities. It's not that there aren't large cities in lesser developed countries. It's just that they still have large cities. They just may be less developed than what we're used to. So we look at the big aspect here of urban versus rural. There's all kinds of different aspects of it, but when we talk about the larger size of urban settlements, it means that you are going to probably know less people. You are going to meet people who are in specific roles. You may go to the doctor, or you may need to take your dog to the vet, and you're obviously going to be seeing different people. You may see the person that serves you coffee in the morning at the coffee shop, right? And so it's high density, meaning, again, there's specialization of roles. There's competition amongst different social groups, and again, very, very diverse groups. So we talk about urban areas as being kind of this heterogeneous area compared to rural areas because it's so diverse, because there's many cultures and many different behaviors and many different groups of people living in an urban area. People become more tolerant of other people's behaviors. All right, and so we tend to see higher tolerance of diversity and behaviors and cultures in urban areas than we do in rural areas. We also talk about this idea of more anonymity. All right, you're isolated. You may know 5 to 10 really good friends or something maybe, but you don't go to the store and see 10 people you know. Right? Or you don't go to the doctor that maybe you've known for your entire life. It may be a little bit different, right? And so we don't have that same everyone knows everyone else feeling in a major city or urban area. So here's your percent of people living in urban settlements globally. So again, you can see the more developed regions of the world definitely pop on this map. Western Europe, North and South America to some extent. You got Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea as well. Here's our changing percentage of people living in urban areas. So you can see it's growing more and more. Even in developing countries, we're seeing it start to rise more. Developing countries are starting to inch up towards that world line right there. And because of that, we start to see this idea of mega cities. When we talk about a mega city, this is an urban settlement that has a population of 10 million or more people. And we also look at meta cities. Meta cities are cities that have populations of 20 million people or more. So we can see the kind of the historic changes in urban growth from 1750 to 2018. These were the largest cities at different times. So in the 1800s, it was London. 1900s was New York, and today, 2018 and beyond, Tokyo is currently the largest city. And so we're seeing more and more urban growth in those developing countries as well. So we're going to see a shift from Tokyo possibly to other, maybe China or India here in the next few years, probably. So here's your meta cities and mega cities here globally. So you can see the inset there in the upper right is looking closer at East Asia, South Asia, even Southwest Asia to some extent there, and Southeast Asia, because we're seeing a lot more growth going on in those places. Again, that's where most of the people in the world live. There's more people living in that box than there are outside that box, right? And then here's some of the rapid growing cities. And if you look at the United States, all of our rapid growing cities are south and west. And we've talked about that. We've seen that in some of our other data and things we've talked about in class as well. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully you got everything you needed. If you have any questions, as always, go ahead and contact your teacher. We will see you again soon for Chapter 13. Have a good one.